Welcome to Okanagan Pioneers and Places. Tales of pioneering are stories of hardship and optimism. There's really no safety net. If you're a homesteader and you encounter problems, you have to handle them yourself. From childbirth to a broken leg, illness to bad luck, getting kicked by a horse. How resourceful you are determines whether you live or die. So when you hear a story like Wagon Train Over the Monoshees about a rancher who for the 4th time pulls up stakes and moves 2,000 miles, you know it's going to be the story of dogged determination. Wagon Train was written by Doug Cox, but it's told to us today by Rob Dinwoody on Okanagan Pioneers and Places. Welcome back to Okanagan Pioneers and Places. Mike Roberts with you, and our storyteller for today is Rob Dinwoody, and he's a guy who's perfect to tell stories about horses because you love to ride. You're a forest agrologist and spend a lot of time looking after grazing permits for the Ministry of Forests.
That's right.
You're an entertainer, Western entertainer.
Sing the cowboy songs, Mike, and I love doing it.
And you got the phrases. How do you know if the coffee's ready?
Coffee's ready when the horseshoe floats.
Good stuff. Who are we talking about today? Who's this guy Patterson?
This guy Patterson, George Washington Patterson. He's a fellow that was brought up in the United States of America, Sacramento, California. He had a little altercation with the Pinkertons, drove him and his brother down towards Tombstone in Arizona. Once again, they encounter some outlaws, and they wisely chose to move north into the Montana country. Jackson Hole, where once again the Curry Gang, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. His dear wife says, honey, I think we better move up north to Alberta. They took the estate of his brother Dick that passed away, 250 head of range horses, and moved up to an area called Crawling Valley, a little bit north of Drumheller, Alberta.
So with 250 horses, and how big a family? How many people are here on the Patterson Ranch?
Well, we're looking at George and Mary Alice, and they had 4 children, 2 boys, Roy, Bill, Ina, and Ida, and Roy and Bill married, and they also had children. And so we're looking at quite an established family. The main economy, of course, is their range horses. They're selling, at that point, the farming industry was growing and the prairie grass was being plowed under, and so horses was the industry of the day.
Yeah, and he had a big herd of them and was doing quite well, I take it.
He was doing very well, about 500 head of horses in a wide open range country where they would range the horses, round them up in the old cowboy way from Montana. And George Patterson was one of the cowboys, and he did things the cowboy way.
Yeah, I mean, he was a pretty smart guy, too. I mean, obviously wise enough to escape all of those earlier stories you said, but smart. His dad was a frontier doctor, so he had wisdom, he had wits, and he had experience.
He did, and when you look at that area they moved to, there wasn't a lot, like most frontier prairie towns, there wasn't a lot going on. They established the school. Probably a few families only attended it, and yet they educated their children. They looked after the horses. They did the roundup. 1929 hit, however. This was in the mid-20s they got there. The economic crash worldwide, the Dust Bowl of the Prairies drought. Mary Alice, his wife, took ill and actually passed away, and George Washington Patterson had a decision to make, and he decided that he'd go to the last frontier in Canada where you could actually raise horses, and that was up in Burns Lake, British Columbia. A trek of about 2,000 miles.
And what route was he going to take from Drumheller, Alberta, to Burns Lake?
Well, he was going to take a route that we wouldn't take today because of the Trans-Canada Highway. The only accurate or easiest route for him to take was down through Pincher Creek, across the Crow's Nest Pass, and then up the Monoshees, through Vernon, and then north through Kamloops up to Burns Lake. That was the route they decided to take.
250 horses, the whole family.
The whole family.
How do you travel? What was his? What would he trundle with him?
Well, the mechanism of travel, they had 2 wagons that they had used. They were farm or ranch wagons of the day. They made them covered wagons. One would be the cook wagon, the other carried the harness and their few belongings. And interestingly enough, Mike, they pulled a 1929 Chev truck with a team of horses. I guess he saw in the future that mechanization had taken over and he'd need the truck in the future.
One day he'd be able to afford gas, and he wanted to have that truck around.
That's right. So they head out from their Drumheller home, heading in a southwesterly direction towards Pincher Creek, heading up to Burns Lake, a trek of about 2,000 miles.
All right, going to take a break here because obviously this kind of a story is fraught with peril, and we're going to get into some of those perils in just a few minutes. Welcome back to Okanagan Pioneers and Places, telling the story of George Washington Patterson with a small herd of horses coming to British Columbia. 250 horses moving across rangeland must be one thing.
That's right, Mike.
Getting on the roads must be another.
250 head of range broncs. These horses were half Clyde and a mix of other breeds. They weighed about 1,500 pounds, and you can picture this herd. They had them in two groups, 100 head in the first group, 150 in the second group. And after about 10 days of travel on gravel roads, because there was no pavement in that day, these horses started to get sore and lame. And George Washington Patterson cared for these horses. So this was his livelihood. He said, boys, we're going to shut her down here at Pincher Creek, and we're going to have to shoe these horses, or we're not going to make it to Burns Lake.
250 horses, 4 shoes apiece.
That's 1,000 hooves, Mike, that need to have a horseshoe hammered on.
Now, isn't it usual that you break the horse first and then shoe the horse?
Yes, these were not old brood mares, and you didn't stand behind them and lift up a leg. You had to rope them, tie them down. There'd be nothing but hair, eyeballs, and fury, and kicking hooves, so they had to bring them down, hog tie them, and then try to bang on that horseshoe as best they could. It was not exactly a pristine, perfect shoeing job, but they got the shoes on nonetheless. And you can imagine, 6 nails a shoe, 1,000 horseshoes, in about an hour and a half apiece. It took 5 days, very long, tiresome days, and everybody was involved. And after that week, they were ready to go again. George got the whole trek moving in a BC direction. And on they went.
Cue the bureaucracy. Just when you've got all of that mess looked after, who shows up?
Well, just about about 30 miles this side of the BC, or the Alberta side of the BC border, a constable of the RCMP stops the whole outfit. Boys, 5 o'clock in the morning, he says, you do not have an Alberta road permit to drive horses on Alberta roads. Well, who would have thought of that? Well, George said, boys, he says, he kind of gave them the wink. He says, boys, you get these horses moving to BC. I'll tie up this constable in paperwork. And he went back with him, and he said, keep them going. And so for a steady day's drive, they moved these horses out of Alberta country and into British Columbia, and quite effectively tied up this young constable that was meaning well, and the cowboys got into British Columbia.
Sure, from the frying pan into the fire, because I'm thinking to myself, across open prairie, 250 animals can spread out,
Yep.
and they'll be out of the harm's way. In British Columbia, you're herding them down narrow roads in narrow valleys.
Well, in British Columbia, you can picture the Rocky Mountains. I think we've all traveled that. Very, very steep areas. In those days, it would have been not much different than what a logging road would be. Very narrow path. Horses stretched out for literally half a mile, headed up by these wagons. Vehicles would come along, and it would take literally an hour to 2 hours to pass through these horses. These horses were accustomed by that time to road travel. Some of the banks you can picture looking down a mile down to the river below, and spooky horses. There's one of the fellas that came along on the journey, a cowboy, is riding a horse called Spooky, and 45 minutes looking straight ahead, and finally he had to get off because he just couldn't take it anymore, and he led his horse. They went from that point. They had to get through the Rockies. They got to an area of Cranbrook where there was good grazing, and they decided that they would head up through the Monoshees and toward Vernon.
Now, I mean, it's not without loss. I mean, sometimes the people who were driving the roads did not take kindly to being obstructed by these horses.
That's right. One episode that occurred was that a tourist that didn't take kindly to this herd of horses, I guess he was a salesperson in some kind of a rush, he encountered this herd and honking his horn, and the horses weren't paying any attention. And in his impatience, he bumped into a colt and actually broke the leg. Well, Bill, George's son, had to immediately dispose of the animal, but in an angry rage, and I can imagine that if you were in that situation, that's what occurred. He grabbed this fella, his brother Roy, said, Bill, leave him alone, let him go through. and they let this tourist pass through the herd. But those are the type of things that they encountered. Evenings, for example, trying to find a place for the horses to graze to get enough feed. They were walking all day. They didn't graze. They didn't bring grain along. They had to find open meadows, which was a task in itself. Finally, they reached Kootenai Lake, where they had to cross at the Belfour Ferry. Another difficult task.
How many horse to a ferry load?
Well, there was anywhere from 30 to 50 horses. They would split them off. Oftentimes there would be the pecking order. You'd have a lead horse. They'd bring it on the ferry, which was nothing more than a big barge, and they'd take them across. The problem really wasn't with the horses at that point. They got the horses off. They jumped off into about 6 feet of water. But when they were taking the wagons off, one of the wagons fell over into the mud, broke an axle, and that slowed them down. On they went to the Monoshees, and another difficult trek across the pass in the Monoshees. Quite a spectacle.
Yeah, they must have been like unseen by the people who lived in this country. This is not your normal everyday encounter.
Well, I think it'd be a bit like Barnum and Bailey coming into town. 250 horses, this contingent, like a parade, going through these small communities. Finally get to Vernon. And, right down Vernon, where I mean, it's quite a populated town in 1933.
If you can picture it, I mean, they're coming down Highway 6. They come right down into the city, down 35th Avenue or whatever it is.
Kids would be waving, and it was just a spectacle. Where did these people come from, and where were they going? They took the opportunity. The O'Keefe Ranch was available, and a working cattle ranch at that time. They had a lot of corrals. They corralled the facility. There was a neighbor that granted them the use of their pastures. And the boys set to breaking some of the horses. They were selling horses along the way to finance the trip. And you can imagine rodeo time and
every day, all day.
All day long, breaking horses. It became quite a spectacle. People would come from Vernon, the neighboring communities, to watch this. Finally, old George Patterson said, boys, he says, we're not here to rodeo. We're here to break horses. Our destination is Burns Lake. And so he said, after about a 2-week stay at the O'Keefe Ranch, we're going to pull up stakes here now, and we're going to head out. And so they did, and the next destination was about halfway at that point, another 1,000 miles to get up to Burns Lake.
Okay. All sorts of things are happening right now, too. They decide to make that one more move, but then the family encounters, disease. Why injury or disease didn't stop them before now is strictly a matter of luck, I think.
Well, Bill's wife encountered asthma. And they had to take her back to Vernon at that point. They got about as far as Falkland. They dropped off the girls, and they stayed at a ranch there in Falkland, and they continued on. You can imagine if you got horses moving, you can't stop. And so the family was split at that point. A very difficult time. They were a very, very close knit family, and it was a time of decision for George Washington and George Washington Patterson. When he got to Monty Lake with the family, that would have been about 2 days' travel. They decided at that point that maybe Burns Lake was too much of a trek that year, and they decided they'd go as far as Wallachine, allow their family to regroup before they took the final trek up to Burns Lake.
Okay. Going to take a break here. Be back in just a second, though, because Wallachine isn't the end of their destination, and we're going to tell you about where they finally wind up when we come back after these words. Welcome back to Okanagan Pioneers and Places. Mike Roberts with Rob Dinwoody telling the story of the Patterson family and the herd in the Bronx across the Monoshees. They're deciding now that they can't make it all the way to Burns Lake in 1 year, and they're at Wallachine. Wallachine's pretty dry country west of Kamloops.
That's right. From Monty Lake, they left to Wallachine, Savannah country. It's a kind of a sagebrush, bunchgrass area. Not a lot of snow in the winter, but very, very cold. And they arrive in Wallachine. They graze the horses and overwinter the horses up in the Dead Man Creek area. And after that winter, George and his son Roy decide, after some conversation with the local ranchers, that the Soyuz country is probably more likely a spot to establish a ranch than going up to Burns Lake. And so they head out that following spring and check it out, decide that's the country they want to live in, come back, and they tell this to their brother Bill. Now, Bill's got 7 children, all in school and becoming established, and he decides that he's going to stay in Wallachine. And so the horse herd and the family is split at that point. George heads down to the Osoyoos country with Roy. Roy is remarried at that point, and Bill stays in Wallachine and Savannah area with his family for another winter. And the interesting thing is that the following year, so we're talking a second winter, the following spring, Bill goes to round up his 100 or so head of horses. And for whatever reason, he was only able to bring in about 35 head. This was very disappointing. If this is your livelihood, you can imagine the devastation. About 75% of your herd is
Or was
lost.
it just lost in the winter?
Lost
to
in the
weather?
winter. Yeah, I think a lot of times these horses are very versatile, and I don't suspect that they perished, but rather they found a different country. And you can imagine in that time, the country was still pretty wild, and these horses spread out. And in fact, interesting that in that area today, there still is these what we call feral horses or wild horses, and they could very well be from that herd.
From the Patterson herd of
That's
19, right. I guess now we're talking what,
1935 approximately. Bill decides to at that point, disappointment and hearing from Roy and George that they've found a place down in the Osoyoos country, moves that 35 head of horses and his family down and rejoins the family in that southern Okanagan. And remember, southern Okanagan at that time is still pretty frontierish, and there's wild horses running, and horses being their livelihood. Now they're not selling horses to the ranchers or farmers, but they've established a new industry in raising bucking horses for rodeo. And so we've gone from the
industrial use
That's
of the
right.
horse to the
More
recreational
yeah,
use
that's right.
of the horse.
And they knew horses very, very well, and their horses being very big and stout and wild were exactly what rodeo needed in that day, and they kept themselves quite busy with that, as well as rounding up some of the mustangs and wild horses that still ran free. There's a mountain in around the Summerland area called Wild Horse Mountain, and many of the horses that were there at that time came from the original fur trade, where horses would lame or they'd be left behind, and these established again into wild herds of horses. Yeah. And the Pattersons, then still involved with the horse industry, would round these up and become involved with rodeos in the area, and very well established rodeo contractors they became.
Yeah. Now, you were telling me right at the beginning of the program, you said the way you get horses to move is you have a lead horse.
That's right.
Now, one of these lead horses made it all the way from Drumheller to Osoyoos.
That's right, Mike. There was a lead horse called Lady, and most horses, and they weren't running stud horses with the herd. A lead horse would often be a mare, and Lady was this lead horse. Everywhere that herd went, from the time they left Drumheller, she'd be the lead horse, right up into Wallachine and then down into Osoyoos. She traveled, upwards 1,500 miles, a long ways. And it was interesting that when she finally set foot on her last home in Osoyoos, Lady laid down and just gave up the ghost, so to speak. She had done her job, and it was like a sign, if you like, to George that maybe this is the place that they should settle as a family. And I think a beautiful place and very similar to the country that they had lived in the United States.
Isn't it amazing? Because very often the horse tells you when the day's over, and this
Yeah.
horse told them when the trip was done.
Exactly.
Yeah. As I think about this family, all of the things that could conceivably have gone wrong come back to me. When they were in Wallachine, didn't a little girl go missing out into a herd somewhere?
That's right.
Tell me that story.
There was a daughter to Roy and Josephine, I believe it was, a little girl about 3 years old, and she went missing, and you can imagine the panic. This was wild country and horses and wild creatures around. They found this little girl down in the horse corral, hanging onto one of the horse's legs in the middle of the herd. And it's amazing how horses can sense, I guess, the innocence of a child. And when they found the little girl, she was safe and sound, hanging on to one of the horses that was not noted as one of the tamest horses. But it shows I guess, the understanding of an animal. And I think it ties in real well with the story, because horses and family were their life. And it shows that, once again, how important the horses were, even in protecting their children.
I'm thinking is, how do I get into the herd to rescue the child? I mean, what technique?
Well, they would just walk in. These people were horse people. They understood the temperament of horses, and they walked into the horses, and the horse herd would just split, and rescued the little girl.
My heart would be just splitting right there. What's the story of the King of Thule?
King of Thule goes way back to Drumheller, and George knew that he had to raise horses that were stout and good for farming. He picked up a purebred Clyde stud called the King of the Thules. And this horse was not very pleasant in temperament, a beautiful, anatomically put together horse, but one mean son of a buck of a creature. He would go after every other horse that was in the neighborhood, claim his territory, and actually severely injure some of these horses. Now Carmen, Roy's son, told his dad, he says, if that King of the Thule ever touches my saddle horses, he's a dead duck. And one day he did. It was in the winter. He was chopping ice in the stock tank, watering the King of the Thule with his saddle horse, and that King went right at him. Carmen grabbed the axe that was used to chop the ice, bunked old King right on the noggin between the ears. He went down and took a second swat and finished him off. And in those days, he said, he reported this to Roy and to George, and he says, he had it coming and I killed him. And that was it. In those days,
no recriminations.
I think it was just somebody was waiting for it to be done, and Carmen happened to be the fellow that did it.
Yeah. There's the story, too, of, I mean, if you've got some cattle on the range, there's all sorts of predators that want to take them on, so you usually have a big steer that'll look after them.
Well, in this particular story, there was a big old steer, and they called them mossy horns back in those days, and they were wild animals. This steer was probably 3 or 4 years old, weighed up to 1,500 pounds, and they would take on a bad disposition. Mary Alice Peters, George's wife, got fed up with this steer. He was chasing their children, and she pulled the 30-30 out and dropped him. And once again, just shows you, the type of women, the type of families that lived in that day. You encountered it, and you did what you had to do.
Boy, they make their decision to make the trip, whatever distance it finally ended up to be, 1,000 miles, but still with tremendous hardship. They had to have tremendous versatility, look after one another. The kids had to be as tough as the adults.
That's right. It's a remarkable journey. George had encountered many journeys of similar type coming up from the United States into Canada. He was a stalwart frontiersman, and I think the story just shows the strength of family, shows the strength of doing things together, and a very happy ending as they ended up in the southern Okanagan.
That's right, and raising bucking horses for the rodeo industry, and establishing a homestead in Soyuz in the Bridesville area.
That's right.
I thank you very much for telling us the story of Bronx across the Monoshees. Rob Dinwoody, you might hear him entertaining on some occasions, almost any place, curling rinks, stampedes, the Armstrong Fair. He'll be singing or telling you some cowboy poetry, but he also has a world of great stories on cowboying in the Okanagan. Thanks for joining us for Okanagan Pioneers and Places. We'll see you again next time.